Welcome to the France 24 debate. To impeach the US President, a vote in the House of Representatives puts Donald Trump on the rack. Well, kind of. He's expected to face a trial in the Senate eventually, where the Republicans have a majority. And Republican senators such as Mitch McConnell have made it known that they will not vote against their man Trump. No intention, he says, of being an impartial juror, as the process demands. Well, our guests to debate the issues are here, revved up, ready to go. Let's introduce them to you by, well, it's not in order of preference, it's how the cookie crumble on this particular one. Joseph Smallhoover is International Counsel for Democrats Abroad. Good to see you, Joe. Thanks for being with us. Sat with him is Celestine Bonin, who is a journalist, but I know it's much more than that. You're formerly of the New York Times and currently a professor of journalism at the esteemed Sciences Po here in Paris.
Make it sound so great.
Well, it is great, and it's great to see you, and it's always always lovely to have you as a guest here on France 24. Great to see you. So we got Joe, Celestine, one more guest to come who's stuck in these accursed traffic jams which the strikes have created here in Paris. And we have another guest who joins us from afar. Eric Lissan is a legal analyst that we use very frequently here. Eric, looking good there in Washington. Good to see you. He's a lawyer both in Paris and in the United States, and a former US federal prosecutor. I will bring you all in very quickly to talk about this, but first, let's take a look at our report on the story so far.
Ahead of a historic impeachment vote, fury from the U.S. president. In a letter to the Democratic leader of the House of Representatives, Donald Trump called the measure an unequaled and unconstitutional abuse of power. When the House meets Wednesday, it's expected to impeach the president along party lines over abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. Trump seemed all but resigned to that Tuesday and said he's ready for the next step.
What do you say to Americans?
Look, it's a hoax. The whole impeachment thing is a hoax. We look forward to getting onto the Senate. It's a witch hunt, and it's just a continuation. It's been going on now for almost 3 years, and it probably started before I even won the election.
Democrats say Trump violated his oath of office by withholding military aid to Ukraine in a bid to pressure the country's president to investigate Democratic rival Joe Biden. They also say he interfered with Congress's investigation into the matter. If the House does impeach the president, it would trigger a trial to remove Trump from office in the Senate. But the upper chamber is controlled by Republicans allied to the president. On Tuesday, they rejected a call to allow key witnesses from the administration to testify, something criticized by the Senate's top Democrat.
The 4 witnesses we proposed have direct knowledge of why aid to Ukraine was delayed. We don't know, as I said, what kind of evidence they'll present. It may be incriminating. It may be exculpatory. It may influence how senators vote. It may not. But they certainly ought to be heard.
An eventual trial in the Senate would begin on January 6th. While 2 U.S. presidents have been impeached, neither was removed from office.
So Donald Trump about to join that very select group, infamous perhaps, of 3 presidents who've been impeached. Well, Nixon wasn't impeached, was he? He resigned before.
That's right.
But basically, he was basically, for the want of argument, let's say 3 that were impeached. Trump about to get that. But of course, his supporters saying this whole thing is a mockery, and Trump himself saying it's the biggest lack of process since the Salem witch trials, I think was the phrase that he used, which has a comic ring to it. But even the mayor of Salem criticizing him, saying, hang on, that's wrong, because there was something happened there which was an absolute tragedy, and what you've done is incredibly dodgy. Joe, give us your thoughts.
Well, first of all, I think it's really important to keep in mind that this is not a criminal trial. The criminal trial is something else. The Constitution provides that the president can be removed from office for high crimes and misdemeanors, and historically, it was quite clear at the time when they were writing the convention what that meant. It did include some actual criminal violations, but it also included the very notion of abuse of power. And the provision is clear from the Federalist Papers. The provision was put into the Constitution in order to allow the Congress, who is the first article of body in the Constitution, to supervise what the executive branch was doing, and so they could be removed if they were abusing their powers in certain ways. So it's clear that it's not necessarily a criminal trial. That's first thing. Second of all, since it's not a criminal trial, the rights of criminal procedure also don't apply. And if there were to be a criminal trial afterwards, however, then they would kick in. But this is a different story. This is a different process entirely, and we need to keep that in mind. And thirdly, the president's letter of December 17th is one of the most exaggerated pieces of claptrap
So
anyone could
this is
ever
the letter that he sent to Nancy Pelosi.
It is indeed. right.
Okay. Do you want to give us a...
Well, it's
give us some of your thoughts.
6 pages of.
Let me point out to people first, because you're from Democrats abroad, someone from Republicans abroad is on his way. The space is there for him. He's stuck in the traffic because the strikes are really affecting everybody here in Paris. As soon as he arrives, he's called Randy Yellows. We'll let him in. But Joe, back to you.
Well, almost certainly, and he will almost certainly contradict everything I have to say. But it's clear that this is a fluff piece intended for his audience as usual, just as his rallies are intended to rile people up. It's full of falsehoods, misstatements, and rantings and exaggerations. And he also does things which I think are pretty much he takes after Nancy Pelosi for having said that she prays for him. Essentially attacking her honesty as a Roman Catholic and of her faith, whereas no one dares do the same thing. Where anyone to try to question his faith, he gets entirely crazed about that. That has nothing to do, in fact, with impeachment. It's just part of the way that this letter is put together and his entire defense. This president believes that he is above all control, that the president is essentially monarchical and practically imperial, and that he cannot be investigated either by Congress or by the courts or by anybody else. And therefore, if that's true, and if the Senate does not remove him from office, then there is basically nothing that a president can do that would require removal from office. And this is a very grave moment in the history of the Republic. In the case of Andrew Johnson, he was refusing to cooperate with the Republican-controlled Congress in the post-Civil War era. In the case of Richard Nixon, who wasn't, as you noticed, as you mentioned, was not impeached, but was going to be impeached, and he resigned on the eve of that vote. And Bill Clinton, the Republicans impeached him for a simple lie under oath, compared to the abuse of power that we have. 700 pages in the House's report, 700 pages about that. That's quite a difference. So it's clearly they're taking an incredible partisan view, and it's, in my view, from a constitutional point of view, a very dangerous one, because they're not taking this seriously.
Joe, thank you very much indeed. Let's bring in Celestine to answer a basic question. Have you ever seen anything like this in your career?
No, I mean, actually, I was in the Soviet Union when Clinton was undergoing impeachment.
I remember you told me about that the first time we met. Yeah.
But so I was not sort of witness to what went on. Things were now so different, and I think the thing that's so sad is that, I mean, it's not just about Trump. It's about how the country is divided really in two, and no Republican is going to vote for this. And in the Senate, the prognosis is definitely that the Republicans will carry the day because they have the majority. And I think, story after story, report after report tells you that families, communities, Democrats who are going to vote for impeachment have been shouted down at sort of town hall meetings in their districts by the way, kind of organized Republican provocateurs. But it doesn't matter. The fact is that that's how divided the country is, and that wasn't the case in Clinton's impeachment.
And as Joe was saying, the I nearly said misdemeanors. Is that the correct expression? The issues on which the other three were kicked out. Johnson was about being a bit too lenient on.
They weren't kicked out. I mean, Clinton was not kicked out.
But
he was
they're brought
impeached.
to book. Sorry, let's get the terminology correct.
Right.
They were impeached. So Clinton was over a sexual misdemeanor, which he lied about on oath.
It was the lie.
It was the lie. But it's the lie that did it. The perjury that did it.
Which is a crime.
Obviously, with Nixon, obviously there was the bugging of the Watergate building, but he resigned before it went to the process. Okay. And then with Johnson, it was about being too sympathetic to the defeated Confederacy. Is that correct?
That's pretty much, yeah. And he was not. The Republicans at that time wanted to be much harsher on the Confederacy.
And we're going back to 1868.
And he was impeding it. So in a sense, it was kind of an abuse. The basic argument was the same: an abuse of power. He wasn't doing what Congress had told him to do.
These three gentlemen have been down the road, as it were. Donald Trump could join them in a fourth. There we go. But in terms of what Donald Trump's accused of doing, Celestine, it seems to be a step beyond what these three did.
Well, I mean, again, back to what Joe was saying, I think, the fact is it's not necessarily a crime. I mean, this would require another procedure and another venue to decide that. But the fact is it is an abuse of power when he tries to bully a small country into undertaking an investigation of a political opponent. That's first charge. The second charge is obstruction of Congress, which has been about not letting different people testify, and that will apparently continue into the Senate trial, where the Senate Majority Leader, who is a Republican, has said with, as you said, actually no uncertain terms, there will not be allowing. And it's actually a very funny kind of a mirror situation, because the Republicans are complaining that they weren't allowed to call witnesses during the impeachment proceedings, and but they're very happy to block witnesses at the trial. I mean, at this, there have been a lot of
There's an element of convenience there,
loose
isn't there?
terms used.
Yeah.
I mean, they talk about the secret meetings in the basement. Well, the committee room was in the basement, and the Republican members of the committee were perfectly allowed to go in and out of what were called closed hearings in normal parlance. So they're playing with fast and loose, But my only question is, I think that they do, beyond the procedural issues, they do argue that they do not have the proof that this is an impeachable crime. And I think that's a matter of politics, but it's also a matter of conviction.
Well, there are two charges, and one could quibble. I'm not going to, because I believe it was an impeachable offense. To basically try to bribe the president of Ukraine, a quid pro quo. But the second one is the obstruction of Congress. And in fact, constitutionally, and I think in my view, in the way that the whole thing is set up, the whole way Constitution is set up, the Congress is supposed to be able to investigate what the executive is doing. The executive executes the laws that Congress adopts, and they have an oversight function, and it's quite clear. And by specifically refusing to allow 27 of his senior members of the White House staff and the State Department to testify, by refusing to hand over documents that the Congress has specifically subpoenaed, they didn't just ask for them; they went through the process of subpoena, a formal process of requesting, demanding those documents. He is, in fact, claiming an imperial presidency. Nixon talked about the imperial presidency, and some of his advisors did, but it never got quite to that point. Here we actually have a man who is acting like Caesar. Right.
Let me stop you there. Let me bring in Eric Lissan, who is, of course, a former federal prosecutor, and he's been observing the situation for us. And Eric, you and I have spoken a number of times about this, and it's a very interesting sort of viewpoint we're getting here from the studio. We'll have the Republican viewpoint in a moment. Eric, sir, tell us what you think about this whole idea, because, I've put this question to you before. Is there evidence to impeach Trump, in your view?
Yes, the evidence is very, very strong. And as a general rule, the Republicans aren't challenging the evidence, although I have been listening to the debate this morning. Some people like Representative Collins are saying, no, we do challenge it. There really was no conditionality. There really wasn't anything bad that happened. But that's a very general, conclusory, and quite minority viewpoint. Any objective analysis of this shows that what is alleged actually happened. The president withheld congressionally authorized aid, which is a crime in itself, or an illegal act in itself, in order to confer a personal benefit on himself. In this case, it was to ensure that he would have better standing in the next election. It was to enhance his personal political standing, and it was at grave danger to the national security of the United States. Nobody's really been able to contradict that. We have seen on the Republican side some protestations that no, he really was trying to get at something else. But this is all contradicted by a great number of other witnesses who have come in and testified under oath. So that part of it is well established. And what we're seeing that is concerning on the Republican side is a blanket denial of this reality, an attempt to distort and suppress this otherwise what would be considered an objective truth. Now, it might be that one could say, I don't agree with this, but one could say, yes, but this happens and we shouldn't remove Trump from office for this. That's another argument, but that's one that the president doesn't want to make. He wants to insist that all this is perfect. And that's perhaps the most disturbing element of this, is the stranglehold over the Republican Party, the turning of all Republicans into anybody who wants to claim that they're a Republican today has essentially to declare themselves a sycophant and a toady and repeat the lies of the president. That's what's difficult here.
Eric,
now,
I need to pause you there.
Eric,
please save that for part two. There's one other thing, please. Hold that thought, please, sir. Please hold that thought. Short break, then after back with part two of the France 24 debate. Stay with us. Welcome back. We're discussing the situation in Washington. To impeach the president is what we're calling it. Let's go straight back to Eric Lissan, who was making a very interesting point before the break. Eric, back to you to make that second point, please.
That point was simply that the Constitution requires an overwhelming supermajority in the Senate, 67 votes, and that's the difficulty here. If it was only a simple majority, there probably would be there probably would be a simple majority that would vote to remove the president. And we'll see how that plays out. Right now, there's 47 Democrats, all of them except for maybe one, Joe Manchin from West Virginia, which is heavily Republican. He hasn't said, and he tends to vote Republican on controversial issues. But all the others are clearly have stated the evidence. They have an open mind, but the evidence presented so far has been unrebutted. Now, on the Republican side, while it seems a near impossibility to get 20 of them to come over, which would constitute the required 2/3, to get a simple majority would only require another 3 or 4 to get an absolute majority of 51 if all 47 of the Democrats go, including Manchin, as I mentioned. So that is entirely possible. So there could very well be a situation that we have here where a majority of the Senate does say that the president should be removed, but it still doesn't rise to the level of the supermajority, the 2/3 that is required. But that in itself is historic, because even with Bill Clinton, there were not 51 senators that wanted to remove him. And the Democrats, the opposition party there, the configuration of the Senate was more favorable then to the opposition party than it is now. So that's simply my other point there, that hasn't been emphasized, but that is the situation. And later, after the president finishes his terms, we may very well see a criminal trial of the president, because the evidence here is that strong that it could meet the highest burden of proof in American law, which is beyond a reasonable doubt, which is the criminal standard. And an impartial jury charged by a judge to apply the facts to the law very well could convict the president of crimes here after his term concludes. That's the seriousness of the situation the country is facing.
Eric Lissan, thank you for the moment very much indeed. Eric Lissan there in Washington. Here in the studio, Celestine Boylan, journalist and professor at Sciences Po of journalism, and Joseph Smallhoover from the Democrats abroad. Thank you. We've been joined by our missing guest who was stuck in the traffic. Glad you could make it.
Thank you very much for having me.
You are Randy Yellows, French-American attorney and member of Republicans Overseas. We're looking forward to hearing your points of view. Let's first have a reminder of the allegations against the US president.
Thank you.
Democrats have unveiled 2 articles of impeachment, or 2 formal charges against President Trump. As outlined in the House Judiciary Committee's 658-page report, one of these charges is abuse of power. Democrats accuse Trump of abusing the power of the presidency by putting personal concerns over national interests. They say Trump violated his oath of office by withholding military aid to Ukraine in a meeting with the country's president in a bid to pressure it to open an investigation into his Democratic rival in the 2020 election, Joe Biden. Democratic lawmakers say such an investigation had no legitimate state interest and would benefit the president personally and politically, all the while compromising elections.
President Trump abused the power of his office by conditioning 2 official acts
to get Ukraine to help his reelection. In so doing, he undermined our national security and jeopardized the integrity of our next election.
The second article of impeachment is obstruction of Congress. Democrats accuse the Trump administration of obstructing the impeachment inquiry by blocking witnesses from testifying and withholding requested documents despite several subpoenas. The White House disputes the charges.
The people are absolutely disgusted. The impeachment is a hoax. It's a sham. It started a long time ago, probably before I came down the escalator with the future First Lady. Started a long time ago.
Under the U.S. Constitution, the president can be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors.
And of course, the debate continues in Washington. Let's bring in for comment Randy Yallows, who's just joined us, French-American attorney and member of Republicans Overseas. Thanks for joining us. I hope you're installed, happy to talk and ready to go. We heard Donald Trump there saying that it's a hoax, it's a scam. Do you agree with that?
I think because he's already really fed up with the situation. I think if we go back to the beginning of the investigation, we have investigations regarding the issues of impeachment since the beginning of his office. And that's where I think the issue begins. What are the motivations? And most of the problem is going along partisan lines. And I think that's where there is that issue of where he's reached a point of saturation regarding how he qualifies the situation. Now,
Are you comfortable with the Ukraine situation? Are you comfortable with this so-called perfect call?
Situation, I honestly believe there is an issue about how we interpret the executive powers on foreign policy, to what extent we will interpret what it can be said, how it can be said, and it's an interpretation between the separation of power between the executive branch and the legislative branch. And I think it's a question of fact, and those issues have come up not only on this administration, there have been other issues like that in the past historically, and I think today we're debating those type of issues. We can turn around and say also what would happen if does certain acts of Congress go beyond their powers in getting involved in certain foreign policies in certain circumstances. There have been issues in the past.
Randy, I have to put this to you. Did Trump lean on Zelensky over the military aid?
The facts... There's an issue regarding how the facts have been brought forward, and I think there are major issues, and I think you've developed it as quite a bit regarding then all the hearings. We've seen how the hearings have been behind closed doors, the issue of having Trump's attorney present, whether he could cross-examine certain witnesses, bring his own witnesses, having access to the files, and I think there are major issues regarding
he's blocked witnesses coming forward, hasn't he? He stopped certain witnesses coming forward.
The issues that you've had regarding the witnesses, I think. There were certain subpoenas that were filed, and there's naturally there's an issue regarding the obstruction of justice. Well, behind those, there are actually before the court's issues today regarding whether those subpoenas are valid. Now, there is a political agenda behind it saying that we do not want to wait until we've exhausted all the means before the court, whether the subpoenas are legitimate or not. The same thing goes with we can use the similar example regarding the tax declarations of Mr. Trump. He's raised them before the courts. It'll be heard before the Supreme Court. And once that's done, it will be decided yes or no. Today, it is legitimate that there's an issue, and we're in a state of a democracy. If he feels that they go beyond the privileges that are granted to one branch of government or not, he will go before the courts, and he's challenged them.
Let me give Joseph a chance to come back on that one as representative of Democrats abroad. Sir.
And as an attorney. And professor of constitutional law, just saying that. The question isn't that, Randy, and you know it. The reality is that Congress is given the oversight over the executive. He does not want to give those documents. And as he says, these people would actually tell the truth and I would be exonerated. Well, then let them testify. But no, the truth is they won't exonerate him, and that's why he doesn't want them to testify. This is not a question, he is not actually putting forward a question of executive power. He's putting a question of protecting his presidency and himself. So that is a very grave problem. With respect to the taxes, that's a different story. And that's entirely different. It has nothing to do with the impeachment process whatsoever. It's not a question of, because we've been trying to get those from a different source for a very long time, and the courts will be taking care of that. But this is a question of the power of the Congress, and it is uncontroverted that Congress has the right to do these things. We already had the same situation in Nixon. It was decided by the court in the Nixon case. When we had the question of the tapes, the court said that Nixon had to give up the tapes, and when he did, they immediately resigned. The question here is exactly the same. It's been decided, and the Congress has the right to do that. Now, that's the first thing. Second thing, the process that the Senate has announced that it wants to do is itself a kangaroo court in the reverse. Minority Leader Schumer put forward as potential rules for the process the same rules that the Republicans put forward in 1998 for President Clinton, and which were adopted unanimously, including with the vote of Mitch McConnell. And now they don't want to follow their own rules, just as they didn't like the rules that were used for the impeachment process in the House. We used the same rules that they had used before, and they didn't like them. So, this is really talking out of both sides of your face. It's just not right.
One second, Celestine, quickly.
I mean, I think that the other fact is that in the other impeachments, I mean, Nixon's, which didn't go to the end, and in the case of Clinton, the White House did allow people to testify. I mean, and there was no question of opposing, as far as I know. And I mean, he protected the tapes until the very end, but ended up having to give them up. So I think that, having people testify, particularly given that the Republicans have been so loud about complaining that they couldn't bring their witnesses into the impeachment process. I mean, they're really sort of strangling themselves with their own rope, I think.
Randy Yados.
Yes. At least from the vision that we've had in the polls, and that actually depends on the polls, there's also, for us, there's a sense that there's been a biased approach to the way the hearings have been handled, how you're managing the whole procedure and the investigations that have been going on. And I think there are issues regarding that. And I think if you go, let's be honest with ourselves, go look back at the impeachment period investigations that were done in the Clinton administration. The Clinton attorneys had access to the files. They were put in a situation they could more properly defend Clinton interests than Trump was at those times. And I honestly don't understand why, since the beginning, if they were so clear, why couldn't we have much more equitable and fair types of conditions for which we could then go forward to the American people and say, look, this is how we granted you access, how we held our investigations, how we have access to the witnesses, how you can present them. It's biased because it's always putting in this position whether there's information that's held confidential during certain hearings, and then they decide, the Democratic leadership, that they release certain information, biased type of information, to give the public a certain interpretation. So it is from that point of view.
Randy, let me stop you. Let me bring in Eric Lissan, a former federal prosecutor, to answer that point about whether this process is biased. Eric, I hope you're still with us because I'd be keen to have your thoughts on what Randy Yalos from the Republicans Overseas was just saying about the whole process being biased.
Yeah, with all due respect to your esteemed guest, I just don't know what he's talking about. I mean, he is repeating things that Republicans have said. They are generalized conclusions, but when you look at the individual specifics of it, none of it holds water. No prior president that has gone through this process, Clinton most recently, beforehand, as you mentioned, to go to the conclusion of, you'd have to go all the way back to Andrew Johnson in the post-Civil War era. But comparing it with Clinton and even with Nixon, there was no obstruction like this. There was no blanket refusal to cooperate with the dictates of Congress. And all the information, all the evidence, which is voluminous, that has been gathered has been made available equally to both Republicans and to Democrats. And even with all of the obstruction that has occurred, the evidence that has come out is nonetheless overwhelming on its facts. It's practically irrefutable. It's one of the strongest cases that could be imagined. So the complaints about process, yes, these are things that the president is putting forth, and he's comparing it to the Salem witch trials, but they're preposterous, and they tend to indicate, rather, that the speaker, in the case of the president in his letter, is unhinged and is actually a danger to the security of the United States and hence the free world of which he is supposed to be the leader. But if you look at the specifics of it, and even going forth, as your other guest alluded to, the Democrats want other witnesses that have been prevented from testifying to come forth and testify in the Senate trial, notably John Bolton and Mick Mulvaney. There has not been a colorable legal argument put forth by the Republicans that they shouldn't at least honor the subpoena to the extent that they have to come forth and appear and proclaim exactly what it is they're hiding behind through which they shouldn't testify. They haven't even done that. The court opinions that we have so far indicate that the Republican position isn't going to withstand any scrutiny in the courts, but that has to go all the way through the appellate process and may go to the Supreme Court. There isn't time for all that. But it would be interesting to imagine, based on what we know, what Bolton and Mulvaney would testify to, it would be very damaging to the president. So we just have to assume that that's the case, and that the reason he's preventing them from testifying is precisely because they would add to the case against him.
Eric Lissow, thank you very much indeed. Let's come back to the studio. Celestine Boylan.
Well, I just wanted to, I'm not a lawyer, and I find it astonishing that McConnell. Mitch
McConnell. No, please do not confuse me with him.
Mitch McConnell. Sorry, I'm so sorry.
It's okay. Carry on, Celestine. Carry on, please.
No, that he has said right from the start that he's not an impartial juror in this case. So he will accept he's working hand in glove, he said so proudly, with the president's counsel. And I don't see how that, when it gets to the trial, that can be presented to the American people as a fair situation. I mean, that's just, given the fact that this issue about witnesses being allowed and not allowed has already come up, that's only a hint of what's going to come next.
Randy.
With all due respect.
You're itching to come in, I know. Go ahead.
Yes, with all due respect. What I understand, and that's unfortunately the way things have been done when we're on two sides of the debate, is that my honorable guest doesn't know what he's talking about. That's what I'm hearing on the Republican side. When I'm
giving you the chance, sir, to
yes,
answer
but
back,
I
please.
think it's important to say so, just the way the presentation is regarding now the issues that have been presented. We didn't talk about the issue regarding the courts. Now, there's a political agenda. And again, they're not coming to courts. They've raised the issue.
Everything's
no,
political.
A political agenda,
everything's
but
political.
If there is an issue with which the White House does not agree with the subpoenas, how they're done or what, and they'll be presented before the courts. Our dear respected guest, who is on the other side, knows that perfectly and just stated in 2 seconds, yes, it would be presented along through the courts, the Court of Appeals, and so on through the Supreme Court, whether it's valid or not, the contestation, but he felt there's overwhelming evidence that it should be. And today he's saying, well, there's clear and overwhelming evidence that we should send it through. It's not valid anymore, and this should be decided based on without a trial. And if the White House considers that it's a valid contestation objection, he has the right to contest it.
Randy, I think the question that people who are watching this from wherever they are in the world will be asking is, are you comfortable with what seems to be the fact that Donald Trump was threatening to withhold military aid to Ukraine, which they needed to fight a battle in the east of their country, on the basis that he wanted the president to sanction an investigation into Joe Biden and his son in Kiev? Are you comfortable with that?
Let me explain to you from my point of view. I haven't sat there reviewing the evidence, and I think by looking at the evidence clearly that there are two sides of the story. There's a lot of gray, whether, to what extent, what were the words that were employed, and there's still issues regarding exactly what was exactly said, and there's still objections regarding what's being said and how things were done. So from that point of view, I'm not going to put forward my personal opinion on the situation, and I think if there's still issues of fact, then there's a problem there. It's controversial. They've decided, based on a political agenda, to put forth impeachment. The Democrats have the majority. They'll do so. Without regard to the judicial contestation that's done by President Trump and the White House regarding those different issues. Now, today, you're asking me what my position is. Honestly, I think it's part of foreign policy that are changed. The exact words which are used, I think that's a question whether if they feel that it's an abuse of power, if they think that it was legitimate, they're pursuing it from their point of view. Now, honestly, we, the American people, from where we stand, how can we decide what's right and what's wrong? We're not the courts. We're not the judges in this matter. And I think what's being done, there is a trial being, a public media trial that's being done. There's an agenda to try to create this time.
Speaking as a journalist, we just report what we see.
No, you report what you know. No,
well, we
no,
do.
no.
We do it from France
What you
24, we
report,
do.
what you see is not good, because even the way things are presented, it's already decided. The facts are clear. It's done. It's a violation.
Randy, you mentioned American people. Let's bring in Joe to talk about just to sort of put it to two fellow Americans here, about sort of this issue. I mean, how do you feel about the situation that Randy's describing? You know, there are different nuances, different ways of exploring this.
Let's talk about the courts. As I said, the courts have already decided the question in Nixon versus the United States that the president is not above the law and must turn over documents which are subpoenaed which are subpoenaed. End of story. We don't have to go there. As soon as the courts decide, they will rule in favor of it. That number one. Number two, Congress decides who is in contempt of Congress, not the House, not the Supreme Court. It's a question for the political branches and not for the courts. And number three. And with respect to the people, well, I don't know what the people say, and I don't necessarily believe in polls, but it is pretty clear that we have a grave political situation with respect to Ukraine. But for me, that's not the real issue here. It is a grave one for its national security. But we're talking now about the very fabric of the republic. We're talking about a president who does not believe that the Constitution applies to him and that he is above the law entirely. Because if he can say no to Congress and no to the courts, then he is a dictator, and that is not on. And the House of Representatives and the Senate have a constitutional duty to ensure that the president is not abusing his power. And the refusal, the obstruction of justice provisions here are even more serious, in my view, than the danger that he created with the Ukraine quid pro quo. Absolutely, without a question. And we haven't even talked about the other stuff, which is not on the table. And I'm not going to put it there, but just think of the Mueller report, which did not exonerate him from crimes.
If I can get a 1-hour extension on this program, we can go into that one, no problem. Brandy, final comment from you, sir.
Yes, the final comment, again, I think that the issues of the due process, and I think we need to go back to it to say whether there's specific violations or not regarding access to the evidence, how the evidence was provided, because we are at the end of the investigation today, and you're asking about specific points. Throughout, there were issues regarding the entire hearings that were and investigations were being done. There were issues regarding those violations. Naturally, we won't talk about it now. We won't have time, but we'll get to the Senate and we'll deal with the issue. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I don't
quickly.
understand is that that the facts were debated and discussed in two committee meetings, at least certainly in the Intelligence Committee. The Republican members of Congress had ample time to question the witnesses,
There's a disagreement
and they
on
never really came up with a different set of facts. They basically were dealing with the facts as stated by professional civil servants, by other peoples who actually were participants in some of these meetings. So I'm just waiting for the Republicans to tell me that what I see as true is not true. I haven't heard that yet.
Celestine, thank you. Joe, thank you. Randy, thank you as well. And thanks to Eric Lissand joining us from Washington. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. Thanks to all our guests for a really lively debate about the issues relating to Donald Trump. The discussions, of course, in Washington continue. And here to give us some take on what's happening online across social media, Emerald Maxwell, over to you.
Hello. Yes, I've been looking at what's online. Of course, Donald Trump, he might have not been watching the proceedings in the House, but he has been tweeting all day and pretty much anything that supports his case. But he started off this morning saying, maintaining he did nothing wrong. And he says this should never happen to another president again. And he's asked Americans to say a prayer. That was after he sent Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, a very long and angry letter last night airing his grievances about the impeachment, and which you see that this cartoonist, Randy Bish, has summed up as a sulky, childish taunt. It's true that there's been a lot of reaction from it. The Washington Post, meanwhile, says that it's hard to capture how bizarre and frightening the letter is, calling it rambling, unhinged and lie-filled. The New York Times says they fact-checked it and came up with, says it contains 19 lies. But it's true that it's not everyone's been critical of it. Newt Gingrich, who the former House Speaker, Republican, says he has Trump's back. He says that it actually should be essential reading for every American because it's a comprehensive indictment of the dishonesty and falsehood in the current impeachment process. Presidents Andrew Jackson and Abraham Lincoln would have been proud of it. It's true. It's very long. There's a lot of incendiary stuff in it. The CNN have picked out quite a few lines from it, such as this one where Trump tells Nancy Pelosi, it's a terrible thing you're doing, but you will have to live with it, not I. Which is quite ironic, actually. Some would argue the opposite. And a lot of people have been contrasting Trump's reaction with the last president to be impeached, Bill Clinton. Just a few days before he was impeached, he actually apologized. Let's take a listen.
What I want the American people to know, what I want the Congress to know, is that I am profoundly sorry for all I have done wrong in words and deeds.
So obviously quite a contrast there with Trump's recent behaviour. So a lot of people reacting as well. This Twitter user says Bill Clinton was impeached for lying. If that's the Republican standard, they should be voting on 16,000 articles of impeachment today. # Merry Impeachmas. But then you have Republicans. This guy is the head of Students for Trump. He says that it's really a very partisan issue. And apparently 21 years ago, the Democrat, Jerry Nadler, said there must never be an impeachment supported by one of our major political parties and opposed by the other, which is exactly what's happening today. And actually, if you look at support for impeachment across the American people, the latest Gallup poll says that it's actually fallen recently. It's 46%, and it's fallen by 6 points since the inquiry was first announced. But crucially, among those, it's 85% of Democrats who are supportive of it, and only 5% of Republicans agree.
Emerald Maxwell, thank you very much indeed. Thanks to our guest, Randy Yallows, who arrived battling through the traffic. Thanks for coming along. So great to see you from the Republicans overseas. Thanks to Joseph Smallhoover from Democrats Abroad. Thanks to Celestine Boland, journalist and professor at Sciences Po. And thanks to Eric Listan in Washington. I know you can hear me, sir. Thank you very much for being with us. Stay with us. More to come here on France 24.